The first sign was a trembling in the void, a vibration so faint that only the Emperor's deepest augurs perceived it. Within the gene forges of Luna, where the air tasted of sacred oils and ancient prophecy, adepts froze as the runes along their hololithic displays flickered into spirals no mortal language could decipher. The Emperor stood at the heart of the creation chambers. Vast cables of psychic lightning coiled around his outstretched hands as he shaped the divine flesh of his 20 sons. Yet even he paused when the currents of fate twisted in a direction no vision had foreseen. The warp, usually a roiling ocean of hatred and discord, fell unnaturally silent. Then the star split open. No mortal eye saw the tear form, but every servo engine screamed as if the universe itself were being wounded. A great rift yawned above the artificial cradle that housed the Primarch gestation pods. Its edges shimmered in impossible colors, hues that resisted definition, radiance that felt older than gods, yet filled with a naive joy that had no place in the grim firmament of mankind's future. The Emperor's attention snapped toward the anomaly, his golden aura brightening with dangerous authority. He extended his will into the rupture, attempting to seal it before the ruinous powers could exploit it. But the light that emerged was not born of chaos. It arrived like a meteor of untainted warmth, a pulse of boundless energy that struck with such force that even the Emperor was forced back a single step. The rift spat forth an infant wrapped in a shimmering cocoon of elastic light, its surface expanding and contracting like living rubber. The newborn drifted downward, untouched by gravity, untouched by fear, and the moment the cocoon brushed the air of the gene forge, it dissolved into gentle motes that vanished without shadow. The child floated softly to the cold metal floor, and the infant laughed. Not a cry, not the wail of a being torn from its mother, but a joyous, ringing laugh that echoed across the forges like a comet trailing defiance. The Emperor's eyes narrowed with rare uncertainty. This child bore no sigil of his making, no psychic imprint, no resonance with the arcane sciences used to create the Primarchs. And yet, a power burned within the small form, vibrant and untamed, completely immune to the malignant whispers of the warp. It overflowed from him like sunlight leaking into a cathedral long abandoned. A murmur swept across the chamber as adepts dropped to their knees, unsure whether to pray or tremble. They had seen many wonders, but none like this. The Emperor approached the infant slowly, golden radiance dimming so as not to overwhelm the tiny being. The child stared up at him with black star-bright eyes, filled with a will unscarred by the universe's cruelty. When the Emperor extended a hand, the infant reached out with unthinking trust and touched his armor. The golden plates creaked under a sudden elastic force, a pressure that did not break metal but bent it slightly, as though the child's body obeyed rules different from any life form known to the Imperium. The Emperor withdrew his hand, understanding blooming within his vast intellect. This child was not of the Primarch project. He was not of the warp, nor of any psychic manipulation. He had arrived from elsewhere, another plane, another destiny, cast into the galaxy at a moment of impossible coincidence. A being whose spirit radiated so intensely that even the most delicate tendrils of chaos recoiled from him. But the ruinous powers had already taken notice. The air thickened, the chamber darkened, shadows elongated across the ground, stretching toward the infant with predatory hunger. A distant roar rose from the veil between worlds, a formless chorus of rage and confusion. They sensed a soul they could not corrupt, a joy they could not extinguish, and their malice surged in response. The Emperor instantly swept his will through the forge, erecting barriers of psychic adamant that sealed the chamber from intrusion. But even his strength could not completely erase the resonance of the warp's displeasure. The child laughed again, wholly unaware of the danger, wholly unbroken by the darkness clawing at existence around him. For the briefest moment, an emotion flickered in the Emperor's eyes, one that none of his subjects had ever witnessed. Not fear, not doubt, something far older. The faint recognition of a cosmic joke whose punchline only the universe itself could understand. This child, this inexplicable arrival, bore a destiny that even he could not yet fathom. A surge of hostile energy erupted against the walls of the chamber, shaking the forges. The Emperor's hands rose as he prepared to banish the last remnants of the warp's grasp. But just as the final ripple of the tear began to fade, something unseen tugged violently at the infant, a force neither warp-born nor material, a force outside the Emperor's immediate grasp. The newborn's form flickered, edges stretching like fluid. Before the Emperor could intervene, the child was yanked backward, pulled toward the dying rift, not by malice, but by a strange and incomprehensible destiny calling him elsewhere. The Emperor extended his power in a final attempt to hold the child, but the rift consumed the infant in a flash of radiant light, then collapsed with the sigh of a dying star. The chamber fell silent. Where the impossible child had stood, only a faint warmth lingered on the cold metal, like the afterglow of a vanished sun. The Emperor stared at the empty space, his expression unreadable. Yet he knew with absolute certainty that the being he had glimpsed was no ordinary wanderer. His arrival had fractured prophecy. His departure had altered fate. And somewhere in the galaxy, the lost child drifted toward a world that needed him, toward a life that would forge him into something no Primarch had ever been. A son of the Imperium born not from design, but from destiny. But the warp had not forgotten him, nor forgiven his laughter. The warp swallowed the newborn whole, dragging him into its ever-shifting abyss, where light and form dissolved into endless madness. Yet unlike countless souls that had fallen screaming into this dimension, the infant did not cry out. He did not tremble. He simply drifted, wide-eyed and fascinated, as though the nightmare realm were nothing more than an unfamiliar ocean waiting to be explored. Tendrils of raw emotion surged toward him, hatred, despair, hunger, seeking to wrap around his tiny form, to break him, to reshape him into something twisted and obedient. But every time the shadows touched him, they recoiled as if burned. His presence did not align with the warp's eternal cruelty. It disrupted it. The child laughed again. The sound rippled through the immaterium like a forbidden hymn, a note so alien that the demon hosts faltered in their endless wars. The infant's laughter rang like a clear bell in the storm, untainted by fear, untouched by corruption. Demons turned their formless heads, eyes of fire narrowing as they sensed something they could not understand. A soul that should have been devoured in an instant instead carved a space of its own within the shifting tides, a place where the warp lost some of its furious coherence, where its ceaseless screams softened for a heartbeat. Such a phenomenon could not go unnoticed. The four powers stirred. A shadow vast as an event horizon drifted across the broken sky, its voice a hiss that dragged reality behind it. "What is this thing that mocks our dominion?" it whispered, its words forming as discordant vibrations rather than sound. Another answered with a rumble that cracked the ether like thunder. "It is no son of the anathema, nor of any mortal line. It is an error." A third entity, its form shifting between rot and radiance, leaned closer, amusement oozing from its presence. Errors may be molded, broken, claimed, but when they extended their power toward the newborn, the warp itself convulsed. The infant stretched his arms joyfully, releasing another laugh that shattered the talons reaching for him. The blowback sent ripples across the demon realms, as though the child were surrounded by a natural barrier, a membrane of existence that simply rejected the warp's touch. Where their corruption sought to penetrate, his essence rebounded it with an unconscious force born not of psychic might, but of something even more baffling, an unbreakable will that refused to acknowledge suffering or despair as truth. The Chaos Gods retreated for the span of a breath, calculating. This was no ordinary intruder. No mortal soul could remain intact within their domain. Yet this child flowed through the Imperium with an elasticity that allowed the warp's tides to bend around him without ever penetrating. His spirit stretched, shifted, adapted, but never broke. He floated through the screaming void as effortlessly as a leaf drifting along a river. Their curiosity soon twisted into frustration, for the more they attempted to influence him, the more their power recoiled upon themselves. Every gesture of malice unraveled. Every whisper meant to scar his mind dissolved into soothing static the moment it touched him. His laughter grew louder, as though he found their attempts delightful. The warp, an eternal realm built on agony, trembled beneath that sound. It reacted the way a battlefield reacts to sunlight, piercing through choking smoke, confused, offended, momentarily disarmed. The demons gathered, drawn by the anomaly. Thousands of warped forms encircled the drifting infant. Beasts of horn and fang, swirling masses of sentient flame, grotesque spirits woven from sorrow and sin, all peered at the child suspended in shifting radiance. No agreement held them back. Their nature drove them to consume anything bright or whole. Yet as they lunged, their claws melted into harmless vapor. Their jaws passed through his form as though biting into warm wind. Their howls fractured, fed back into their own throats, becoming incoherent echoes that stirred panic even among creatures born without fear. Still, the child watched them with endless amusement. His limbs stretched bizarrely, translucent and elastic, as though his very biology rejected the rules of the material. He bounced lightly through the void, unharmed despite the monstrosities that assaulted him from every angle. His aura radiated curiosity, innocence, and a vibrant determination to reach something beyond the warp's reach. An instinctive yearning for freedom. That instinct infuriated the ruinous powers. They converged, merging their influence into a single tidal surge of force meant to crush the infant's essence and scatter it across eternity. The warp roared. Demons shrieked. The sea of madness surged as one. And the child, caught in the heart of that cosmic onslaught, simply stretched with the pressure, expanding like a sphere of warm light. The attack passed through him, stripped of momentum, dissolved as though it had struck a boundary the universe itself refused to allow them to cross. A fissure appeared behind the child. Not a warp tear, but a thin line of pale brilliance, shaped like the horizon of another world. It pulsed in rhythm with the infant's heartbeat. The warp snarled in confusion. This breach was not of their making. It carried no scent of the Emperor, no signature of sorcery, no mark of chaos. It was a natural opening, created solely because the soul drifting within the warp was not meant to remain here. The child drifted toward it, drawn by instinct rather than purpose. Demons lunged again, desperate to seize him before he could escape. For once, panic infected the Imperium. The laughter grew louder, brighter. It radiated outward, bending the warp's fabric in concentric waves. And with that simple, joyous sound, the infant slipped through the luminous fissure. The warp closed around its own emptiness, furious and bewildered. The child fell into gravity, into air, into the heavy scent of brine and rust. The world below was harsh and grey, an ocean mining sphere where humanity laboured in chains beneath storm-ridden skies. The newborn crashed into the world like a fallen star, a streak of soft golden light that arced over the roiling waters before vanishing into the labyrinth of machinery and slave barracks. His arrival went unseen by the rulers of this world, but not by those who huddled in darkness, dreaming of something better. The warp, though denied its prize, whispered a vow into the depths of reality. The child had defied them, mocked them, and somewhere within the Imperium he now slept, awaiting the life that would forge him into a force the galaxy could neither predict nor contain. The warp would not forget, nor forgive. He fell through storm-choked clouds like a spark cast from the dying ember of some forgotten star. The fissure that had delivered him from the warp sealed behind him with a whisper, leaving only the howl of wind and the roar of iron seas to greet his descent. The infant struck the world not with the violence one might expect, but with a soft pulse of light that rippled across the surface of a rusted platform drifting in the middle of an endless ocean. The waves hissed against corroded steel. The sky above bled with perpetual rain. This was Carthion 9, an ocean mining world where hope had been suffocated generations ago beneath chains, quotas, and the lash. The workers who toiled upon the drifting platforms were shadows of humanity. Bent backs, hollow eyes, skin weathered by salt and cold. Among them, the infant's arrival should have been impossible. And yet, as the light faded, a small group of slaves gathered around the source of the disturbance, shielding their faces from the stinging rain. At their feet lay the child, unharmed, warm to the touch, as though he carried a sun within his tiny frame. The eldest among them, a wiry woman whose hands bore scars from decades of servitude, knelt and scooped him into her arms. She felt no fear, only a strange sense of familiarity, as though the child's presence filled a space that had long been empty. The infant opened his eyes and smiled. In a world where laughter had been forgotten, the sound broke something open inside those who heard it. The workers carried him back to their barracks beneath the grinding turbines, where 1,000 metal teeth chewed through oceanic minerals day and night. The air smelled of brine, grease, and human despair. But as the days passed, the child became a quiet ember of warmth in the darkness. He grew at a pace slightly faster than normal, his limbs lengthening fluidly, his vitality seemingly boundless. He learned to walk among rusted corridors and puddled floors, his steps light, his curiosity insatiable. The others named him Luffy, taken from an old myth whispered by sailors, who believed in spirits that crossed oceans to free the lost. Luffy did not cry. He did not fear the storms that rattled the metal walls. He did not shrink from the overseers whose boots echoed like gunfire through the platforms. Instead, he watched them with an expression they could not decipher, something between amusement and quiet defiance. When struck, he bounced. When thrown, he sprang back to his feet unharmed. He seemed incapable of breaking. Word of the strange child spread through the barracks like a secret flame. The workers spoke of him in hushed voices, terrified that the overseers might take notice. But the overseers already had. Master Voran, the man who governed Platform 9, was a creature shaped by cruelty and salt. His augmetic arm clanked with every step, its fingers ending in steel talons. He ruled through fear, savoring the despair of those beneath him. When he learned of a boy who laughed at punishment and survived the impossible, suspicion curdled into malice. Perhaps a mutant, he reasoned. Perhaps a threat. Perhaps a curiosity worth selling to the highest bidder. Vorin sent his enforcers to seize the child. The storm that night was vicious, waves slamming into the platform with enough force to shudder the walls. The workers huddled together, shielding Luffy as best they could. But the enforcers forced their way inside, armored boots splashing through the narrow corridors, stun batons crackling. They tore the workers aside and reached for the boy. The eldest woman screamed for them to stop, but her plea was smothered beneath the crack of a baton against the steel floor as Luffy was wrenched from her arms. He did not resist at first. He looked up at the enforcers, head tilted, as though unable to comprehend why they were afraid of him. One of them sneered and swung his baton downward. It connected with Luffy's forehead and bent as though striking rubber. The enforcer stared, frozen. Luffy blinked once and then, with a sound like stretching fabric, his arm elongated unnaturally, whipping forward to strike the enforcer squarely in the chest. The man flew backward, crashing into a turbine pipe with a clang that echoed across the platform. The workers gasped. The enforcers hesitated. Luffy stood calmly, his small fists clenched, an expression forming on his face that no one on Carthion 9 had seen before. A fierce, unyielding determination. When the enforcers charged, Luffy moved with instinctive clarity. His body stretched and compressed in ways that defied reason, slipping through their grasp, bouncing off walls, striking their weapons aside with blows that sent shockwaves through the cramped barracks. The air filled with shouts, metal impacts, and the roar of thunder. The workers watched in awe and terror as the child who had brought laughter into their lives revealed that he was far more than they had ever dared imagine. The confrontation did not last long. The last of the enforcers collapsed to the floor, groaning, armor dented as though struck by a force far stronger than a child's fist should ever deliver. Luffy exhaled softly, his body returning to normal proportions. The eldest woman approached him, trembling, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her and smiled again, as though none of what had happened bore the weight of consequence. But consequences were already forming in the storm-filled dark. Master Vorin watched from the upper gantries, his augmetic eyes gleaming. He had seen enough to understand that this child was not a mere curiosity. He was something beyond control, beyond reason, beyond safety. Too valuable to ignore, too dangerous to leave unrestrained. Vorin turned away, already sending encrypted messages to off-world contacts, inquisitorial agents, rogue psychers, and buyers with more credits than conscience. As lightning illuminated the ocean, Luffy curled beside the workers he had protected, unaware of the storm gathering above and beyond the atmosphere. He was no longer a hidden secret. His existence had been noticed, and the galaxy had begun to turn its gaze toward him, not with wonder, but with hunger. The warp had failed to claim him. The oceanic prison could not contain him. But soon forces far greater than any platform overseer would come, seeking the child who laughed in the face of suffering. And destiny, patiently waiting, prepared to deliver its next blow. The storm had barely passed before the world around Luffy began to change. Word of the confrontation spread across Carthion 9's platforms with the speed of whispered fire. Where his presence had once been a quiet miracle, he now became a symbol the overseers feared, a disruption to the order that kept thousands bent beneath the lash. The workers, though grateful for his protection, lived in terror of the repercussions they knew would come. Order on Carthion 9 was maintained through ritual cruelty, and any spark of rebellion, intentional or not, was smothered with overwhelming force. Luffy sensed their fear. He did not understand it, but he felt the heaviness in the air, tasted it in the silence that followed him down the rusted walkways. His instincts told him danger was approaching, yet he did not shrink from it. Something within him, an ember of defiance older than the stars, refused to bend. The workers tried to teach him to keep his head down, to stay hidden, to avoid confrontation. But Luffy met every warning with the same calm, unwavering gaze. He had protected the people he cared for. Why would he ever stop? The overseers answered that question the next night. Sirens wailed across the platforms as Arbite's gunships descended from the dark clouds, spotlights cutting through the storm winds. The workers scattered in panic as the armored figures landed, towering silhouettes of ceramite and authority, eyes glowing behind skull-faced visors. They fanned out across the platform with brutal efficiency, their vox commands echoing like doom across the metal plains. Master Vorin walked among them, smug and trembling with self-importance, his augmetic arm twitching in anticipation. He directed them toward the barracks. Luffy sensed them before he saw them. A cold pressure filled the air, a suffocating presence that dampened the warmth around him. He stood from his resting place beside the workers who had become his family, stretching his arms idly as the thunder of armored boots approached. The eldest woman tried to push him behind her, her voice shaking as she begged him to hide. But Luffy stepped calmly into the center of the barracks, facing the sealed doors as if expecting their arrival. The doors burst open under the force of breaching charges. Arbites stormed inside, weapons raised, shock mauls humming with lethal energy, suppression shields flaring with crackling arcs. Their commander stepped forward, his voice amplified by vox grills. By authority of the Lex Imperialis, the aberration known as the anomalous child is to be seized and delivered for examination. Resistance will be met with lethal force. The words meant nothing to Luffy, but the malice behind them did. When the Arbites advanced, the workers threw themselves between the soldiers and the boy. They begged, pleaded, offered their meager lives in exchange for his safety. Their cries were met with cold indifference. The commander signaled, and stun rounds fired, hurling bodies aside like broken dolls. Luffy watched them fall, watched their pain, and something inside him tightened, not with fear, but with an instinctive, righteous anger. He stepped forward. A maul swung toward his head. It cracked against his skull with a sharp metallic clang that sent a shudder through the wielder's arm. Luffy did not fall. Instead, his neck compressed like coiled rubber before springing back upright. The Arbites froze, stunned by the impossibility. Luffy's eyes narrowed, a rare seriousness settling over his features. He stretched his arm, fist clenched, and released a strike that sent the closest Arbites flying across the room. Their armor buckled from the impact, bodies crashing into the metal walls with sickening force. Shouts erupted, shock shields rose. More soldiers surged forward. Luffy met them head-on. He moved with a fluidity alien to the Arbites, stretching, twisting, bouncing, slipping through their formation like a dance shaped from instinct and will. Shock mauls hammered against his body without effect, dispersing harmlessly across his elastic skin. Bolter pistols fired stun shells that rippled across his form before flinging themselves backward in distorted trajectories. Every strike he delivered sent shockwaves through armored bodies, knocking them aside with strength far beyond anything a child should possess. But Luffy never killed. He did not understand death, but he understood hurt, and he refused to inflict it beyond necessity. Yet even as he fought, reinforcements poured into the barracks. The Arbites adapted, forming tight phalanxes, shock shields raised to trap him. For the first time, Luffy felt pressure closing in. They surged together, attempting to pin his limbs, restrain his movement, force obedience through overwhelming mass. He planted his feet and pushed back. The floor groaned beneath the strain as his body elongated, expanding with raw force. Soldiers flew backward like stars cast from an exploding core. The entire barracks shook. Luffy inhaled sharply, chest heaving with unfamiliar exhaustion. He had never pushed himself this far. The workers stared in awe and terror, but Voran saw only opportunity. He stepped forward behind the defeated Arbites, his expression twisted with greed. "You are no child," he hissed. "You are a weapon, and weapons belong to those who can wield them." He raised a device, a collar engraved with restraining sigils, humming with low, malicious power. It was a relic scavenged from forgotten archives, meant to bind psychers and mutants. Voran lunged. The collar snapped around Luffy's neck. For the first time, agony tore through his body. His limbs buckled, his vision blurred. A violent constriction cleaved through his very essence, as though the collar sought to crush the warmth inside him. He collapsed to his knees, gasping as his elasticity faltered, shrinking into himself. Voran laughed triumphantly, gesturing for the remaining Arbites to drag the boy away. The workers cried out powerless. Luffy's fingers dug into the floor as the world darkened around him. Yet even as the collar tightened, even as chains wrapped around his arms, one thought rose above the pain, a stubborn refusal to bow. His spirit did not crack. It clung to the faces of those he protected, the warmth they offered him, the simple freedom he cherished. He forced his head up, eyes burning with defiance. Voran froze. For even bound, even shaking, even brought low by pain he had never known, the child's gaze held the same unbroken fire, a fire that promised the chains would not hold, a fire that warned the galaxy this was no weapon to be claimed. The boy who would not bow had taken his first step into open rebellion. And far beyond the storm-choked skies of Carthion 9, distant forces had begun to stir, drawn by the echo of a spirit the warp could not break. The collar's crushing pressure blurred the world around him into streaks of rust and stormlight as Luffy was dragged across the platform. His limbs hung limp, not from surrender, but from the ceaseless pulse of agony that radiated from the ancient sigils carved into the metal around his throat. Every breath felt like drawing air through iron shards. The workers' cries faded behind him, swallowed by the thunder rolling across the ocean. Voran walked at the head of the procession, intoxicated by triumph, his augmetic fingers twitching as though already counting the wealth the boy would bring him. Behind them, the Arbites marched in grim silence, their armor dented and cracked from the impossible battle they had narrowly survived. The storm intensified. Lightning carved white scars across the sky, illuminating the jagged silhouettes of the industrial platforms. Luffy's head bobbed with each pull of the chains, but his eyes remained open. The fire within him refused to dim. Pain was new to him, sharp, cold, unyielding, but it did not bend his spirit. The collar compressed his elasticity, stiffening his body, forcing him into unnatural stillness. Yet deep within his chest, something pushed back, a slow-burning heat that pulsed with each beat of his heart. They reached the landing deck just as the thunderhead split apart at the sound of engines descending from above. Voran looked up, expecting the gunship he had summoned, Instead, a vessel unlike any he had ever seen emerged through the storm. A thunderhawk of the Imperium, its hull marked not with the symbols of local authority, but with the sigils of the Emperor's own custodial forces. Its engines roared with the authority of a god descending. The Arbites stiffened. Voran paled. The Thunderhawk hovered as its ramp extended, slamming onto the wet deck with a force that rattled the platform. Gold gleamed through the storm. Warriors stepped forth, custodians, towering giants clad in auramite that reflected lightning like captured suns. Each bore the unmistakable presence of beings shaped not merely to fight, but to serve as extensions of the Emperor's will. Their movements were silent, their helmets impassive, their halberds glowing with restrained lethality. The foremost custodian surveyed the scene with a gaze sharper than any blade. "This world reported the capture of an anomalous child," he said, his voice resonant with layered authority. "We have come by the Emperor's command." Voran swallowed hard. "Yes, my lord, I captured him myself. A dangerous mutant." The custodian's helm turned toward Luffy. For a moment, neither storm nor machinery dared intrude upon the silence that followed. The giant approached the kneeling child, each stride weighted with purpose. He studied Luffy with the meticulous focus of an archivist examining a relic lost to time. The collar's sigils glowed faintly as the custodian's shadow fell over him. "Release him." Voran blinked. He is dangerous. The collar is necessary. Without it." "Release him," the custodian repeated, tone unchanged but carrying a finality that stripped the overseer of words. Voran hesitated. The custodian moved. In a single step, he seized the overseer by the front of his coat and lifted him effortlessly from the deck. The augmetic talons clattered helplessly against auramite plates. "You presume to restrain a being under the Emperor's protection. Remove the collar, or I will remove your head." Voran fumbled with trembling fingers, finally unlocking the device. The moment the collar loosened, it snapped apart with a metallic crack, as though forced from within. Luffy collapsed forward, coughing as air filled his lungs again without restraint. His body loosened, returning to its natural elasticity. The heat inside him surged, melting away the remnants of pain. When he looked up, the custodian stared back, unmoving, unreadable. The golden warrior knelt, lowering to meet the boy's eyes. He saw not fear there, but recognition, not of face or memory, but of spirit, the same indomitable radiance that emanated from the Emperor himself. A wild, unbound light that refused to kneel before darkness or tyranny. It was impossible. It was undeniable. The custodian extended a hand. Luffy hesitated, then placed his small, warm palm against the cold auramite gauntlet. A pulse of energy rippled outward from the contact, so subtle only the custodian sensed it. Not psychic, not warp-born, but something older than both. A resonance, a harmony between two truths of the same origin. The custodian spoke softly, almost reverently. "Child, do you know who you are?" Luffy tilted his head. He did not understand the question. He only understood that this giant, unlike the others, did not mean him harm. His fingers curled trustingly around the warrior's hand. The custodian rose, lifting Luffy with effortless grace. Turning his back on the terrified overseer, he carried the boy toward the Thunderhawk. "Secure the platform," he ordered without looking back. "Burn the corruption. Spare the innocent." Arbites attempted to protest, but custodians did not listen to mortals. Their halberds ignited, sweeping across the deck with precise arcs that destroyed restraints, neutralized machinery, and shattered weapons without shedding unnecessary blood. Workers fled or watched in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing salvation or the prelude to annihilation. Luffy looked out from the ramp as the Thunderhawk ascended. The eldest woman stood below, clutching her chest as tears mixed with rain upon her weathered face. He reached out toward her instinctively, his arm stretching far across the widening distance. But a custodian gently placed a hand over his shoulder, grounding him, urging him to let go. "Your path lies elsewhere," the warrior said. As the Thunderhawk pierced the clouds, Luffy pressed his face to the viewport. The storm parted above them, revealing the stars beyond, the cold, vast expanse that waited without mercy or promise. Yet as he stared into the void, something inside him stirred, a whisper of belonging, a pull that felt like destiny. Far away, upon the golden throne, the Emperor himself lifted his head. For the first time in centuries, a flicker of emotion crossed his features, a faint echo of wonder. One of his lost sons had returned, but the galaxy would not allow such a miracle to pass unchallenged, and the warp, still smarting from its failure, shuddered with renewed hunger. The Thunderhawk cut through the void like a blade of gold, carrying Luffy away from the storm world that had shaped his earliest memory. He pressed his face against the cold viewport, watching Carthion 9 shrink into a speck amid the black expanse. The workers who had sheltered him, the chains he had broken, the pain of the collar's bite, all drifted into the distance, but not from his heart. Something inside him tightened with a sensation he did not yet understand, the ache of leaving behind those he wished he could free. The custodians stood silently around him, unmoving sentinels carved from living gold. Their presence should have been suffocating, yet Luffy felt no fear. The resonance that had sparked when he touched the first custodian lingered in the air, weaving through the armored giants like an unspoken truth. They did not treat him as cargo, nor prisoner, nor aberration. They watched him the way star priests watch a celestial omen, awed, questioning, wary. Hours passed as the Thunderhawk approached a shape looming vast against the void. A ship, no, a cathedral adrift in space, its flanks carved with statues of saints and warriors, its gun batteries arranged like the teeth of a slumbering titan. The custodian carrying Luffy adjusted his grip and murmured, "We have arrived at the auric crucible." The great vessel opened like a blooming flower, allowing the Thunderhawk entry. Light swept across the landing bay, illuminating marble floors veined with gold and walls etched in sigils older than most civilizations. As the ramp lowered, the air tasted of incense and the faint thrum of psychic wards. Luffy stepped onto the polished floor, his bare feet leaving small, wet impressions from the remnants of the storm. The ship felt alien, monumental, yet somehow familiar, like a memory he had never lived. He followed the custodians through long halls lined with statues of figures whose faces bore the unmistakable stamp of the Emperor's genetic art. Primarchs. Luffy stared up at them with wide, unblinking curiosity. Some radiated nobility, others ferocity, others cold determination. One statue, cracked across the breastplate, seemed to tremble with a sorrow Luffy could not name. He paused before it, reaching out, only for a custodian to place a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Come, he waits." They entered a chamber vast enough to house a battleship, its ceiling lost in shadows. Golden machinery spiraled around a central dais like an ascending crown. Upon that dais, surrounded by drifting hololithic scripts and the glow of ancient machinery, sat a simple obsidian throne. And on that throne waited the Emperor. The custodians bowed at once, a synchronized motion of absolute reverence. Luffy, unaware of ceremony, simply stared. The Emperor's presence washed over him like the sun emerging after a lifetime of storm. Power radiated from him, not as crushing force, but as a quiet, irresistible gravity. His eyes, cold stars of judgment to all others, softened by a fraction when they fell upon the boy. Luffy felt no need to bow. He walked forward until he stood before the throne, head tilted, studying the face that he recognized without knowing why. The Emperor raised one hand, and the custodians withdrew to the edges of the chamber, leaving them alone in the vast golden silence. "You have traveled far," the Emperor said, his voice a resonance that filled the chamber and the soul within it, further than even I can yet fully comprehend. Luffy blinked. His small shoulders rose in a shrug. The Emperor's lips curved, not a smile, but the ghost of one. "You are unlike the others. Your essence bears no scar of the warp, no echo of my shaping, and yet you are mine, my son." Luffy did not understand the words, but he felt the weight behind them. A warmth answered deep within him, like two flames recognizing each other. The Emperor lifted a hand toward him. "Come." Luffy placed his palm against the Emperor's fingers. A surge rippled through existence. The Emperor saw flashes, Luffy stretching impossibly, fighting soldiers twice his size, laughing in the warp, defying demon jaws, standing against cruelty with a joy no darkness could drown. A will unbreakable, a soul untouchable, a heart that sought freedom, not conquest. Luffy saw nothing but light, a warm, overwhelming blaze that wrapped around him like a long-lost embrace. Something old, something true, something that accepted him completely. The contact lasted seconds, yet changed everything. The Emperor withdrew his hand slowly, as though handling a divine artifact. "You will need guidance, strength, purpose. The galaxy tears itself apart, and I require a son capable of restoring balance in his own way." The air shifted. Machinery stirred. Hidden vaults opened around the chamber. Row upon row of power armor, sleek, elegant, shimmering with star-forged metal, rose from the depths. Gene seed canisters glowed with dormant life. The air thrummed with unborn potential. The Emperor stood. The chamber trembled as his presence expanded. "A legion," he declared, "forged not from fear, but from the unbreakable spirit that flows through you." He descended the dais, each step echoing like prophecy. Luffy looked up at him, eyes bright. "You will not command them through discipline alone," the Emperor continued, "nor through terror, nor divine claim. They will follow you because you embody something rare in this age." He placed a hand over Luffy's heart. Freedom without corruption, strength without cruelty, will without despair. He withdrew his hand, golden light fading from his palm. "Rise, my son. Your legion shall be shaped in your image, brave, boundless, unafraid." Luffy felt something stir, a swell of certainty, warm and vast. The Emperor's voice deepened. "They shall be called the Starbound, warriors who charge unbroken into the storm, warriors who believe in tomorrow even as galaxies die." Luffy nodded, though he understood little of legions or war. But he understood storms, he understood chains, and he understood the faces of those he had saved. The Emperor stepped back, studying him with a gaze that pierced destiny itself. "Your path will not be easy. The other Primarchs will resist your ways. The galaxy will challenge you. Chaos will seek to claim what it could not break." Luffy grinned, a simple, fearless grin that shone like sunlight in the shadowed chamber. The Emperor exhaled softly. "So be it." The lights dimmed. The machinery around them roared to life. Gene seed stirred, armor awakened. Across the auric crucible, the birth of a new legion began, one shaped not by rigid doctrine, but by the will of a boy whose spirit the warp could not bow. Far beyond the chamber walls, unseen by mortal eyes, the warp rippled with fury, and destiny, sharpening its blade, prepared the first of many trials for the son who laughed at darkness. The forging of the Starbound Legion was not a quiet event. Across the auric crucible, alarms thrummed in triumph rather than warning as gene seed vats awakened, their dormant contents stirring with nascent life. Luffy watched through the transparent barriers as the first Astartes of his legion took shape, limbs forming with impossible precision, hearts beginning to beat in unison, eyes opening for the first time to the golden light of the Emperor's design. He pressed his palms to the glass, fascinated not by their might, but by the simple fact of their existence. They were people, brothers he felt drawn to before they had taken their first breath. Months flowed with the steady rhythm of training hymns and clashing steel. The Starbound learned philosophy before tactics, compassion before war, unity before command. Luffy was not a conventional teacher. He did not lecture or intimidate. He fought beside them, laughed beside them, sat among them during meals like a brother, rather than a distant figure of legend. His nature shaped the Legion more swiftly than any decree. Where other Primarchs fostered discipline through austerity or iron rule, Luffy nurtured something far more difficult to maintain in the grimdark Imperium: hope. They trained under artificial suns and migrating storms conjured within colossal chambers. When an Astartes stumbled, Luffy stretched his arm to pull him up, encouraging rather than chastising. When they sparred, Luffy's blows sent shockwaves across the training grounds, yet he always offered a hand to steady them afterward. The Starbound learned that strength was meant to lift others, not dominate them. Their loyalty grew absolute, not because he demanded it, but because they felt it returned to them tenfold. When the Emperor finally summoned them to join the Great Crusade, the Starbound boarded their fleet with eager hearts. Their vessels were sleek, adorned not with the grim heraldry common to Imperial warcraft, but with cleaner lines and subtle motifs of open skies and rising suns. Luffy stood at the helm of the flagship, the Sunbreaker, gazing upon the stars with a grin that radiated the same unbowed spirit that had defied the warp itself. Their first campaign came swiftly. A frontier system had fallen into the grip of a tyrant warlord who ruled through terror and indoctrination. Cities dangled from orbital rings like chained carcasses, their populations enslaved in mines that burrowed into the planet's crust. Other Primarchs might have launched an orbital bombardment or executed rapid decapitation strikes. Luffy refused. He remembered Carthion 9. He remembered chains. He led the assault personally, descending into the heart of the fortress world with a strike force of Starbound elites. Bolter fire tore through the air, explosions cracked the ground, and the metallic stench of ionized blood drifted through cavernous passages. Yet Luffy moved through the battlefield with effortless grace, his body stretching and rebounding with impossible fluidity. Bolter rounds struck him harmlessly, flattening against his elasticity before bouncing back in distorted arcs. He swept through enemy ranks like a storm forged from motion and will, sending armored soldiers flying with blows that rang like thunder. Where he passed, the enslaved workers blinked in disbelief. They saw not a demigod wrapped in divine wrath, but a warrior who fought with warmth in his eyes and a fierce determination in his smile. The Starbound matched his intensity, charging forward with cries of unity that echoed down the tunnels. Their discipline was clean, but not cold. Their fury controlled, but not cruel. They protected civilians with the same urgency they brought against the enemy, forming shield walls to block falling debris, catching injured miners as they collapsed. The tyrant warlord watched from his throne of bones as his loyalists crumbled. He unleashed his final weapon, a cadre of psychers bound in chains, their minds twisted by forbidden rites. Warp lightning tore through the air, screaming with malice. Luffy felt the pressure instantly, the familiar itch along his skin, as the warp tried once more to swallow him. But it could not. No matter how violently the psychers hurled their hatred, the energy bent around him, stretching and snapping harmlessly like ropes pulled too tight. He charged through the torrent, reaching the psychers in a heartbeat. His fist met the psychic storm with an impact that split the ground, dispersing the warp energies in a single shockwave that rattled the fortress foundations. The psychers collapsed, freed from their torment, their chains falling away as Luffy caught them one by one. The warlord fled. He didn't get far. Luffy found him in a hidden passage, cornered in the glow of emergency lights. The man raised his blade with trembling hands. "What are you?" he demanded, voice cracking. Luffy's reply was simple. "Someone who won't let you hurt them anymore." There was no execution, no spectacle. Luffy rendered the warlord unconscious, bound him, and delivered him to Imperial custody. The liberated workers watched in stunned silence as the Starbound dismantled their oppressors' strongholds, opened the prison gates, and carried wounded civilians to waiting medici ships. When the campaign ended, the workers knelt in gratitude, yet Luffy knelt with them, placing a hand on their shoulders and lifting them back to their feet. "No kneeling," he said. "You're free." News of his method spread quickly, rippling across the fleets of the Great Crusade. Many lauded the Starbound as a beacon of humanity in an age drowning in iron and blood. But others, especially the Primarchs bred for stricter purpose, looked upon Luffy's ways with suspicion. His refusal to enforce rigid imperial doctrine, his insistence on treating liberated worlds with gentleness, his rejection of needless cruelty. These traits seemed dangerously naive to brothers who believed mercy was weakness. It was Gilliman who voiced the first concern, Perturabo who named it inefficiency, Lorgar who questioned whether such compassion might breed disobedience. Even Horus, who admired Luffy deeply, warned that ideals could fracture once confronted with the true horrors waiting in the dark between stars. Luffy listened to all of them, nodding, smiling, but never changing. The Starbound Legion continued to liberate worlds, their reputation growing brighter with each victory. But the brighter the flame, the deeper the shadows it cast. And somewhere in the warp, a presence stirred, remembering the laugh that had once disrupted its eternal dominion. The galaxy applauded the rise of the Starbound, but the warp whispered a warning. Hope was a dangerous thing to nurture in the 41st millennium, especially when it came from a sun who refused to break. The victories of the Starbound echoed across the expanding frontiers of the Great Crusade, but triumph has weight in the Imperium, and every light draws a shadow. Luffy's legion, bright, unyielding, impossibly hopeful, became a subject of constant discussion among the Primarchs, their commanders, and the High Lords, who attempted to predict the tides of fate. Some praised the Starbound as a miracle in an age where innocence was dying. Others whispered that such purity could not survive the truth that lurked in the galaxy's darkest corners. Luffy felt none of their political tremors. He lived each day with simple clarity. Free those who are suffering, help those who cannot help themselves, stand firm against anything that spreads fear. The Starbound followed him not because of doctrine, but because his presence lifted the weight they all carried. Yet beneath the joy they cultivated, tension coiled like an unseen serpent. Their next campaign brought them into a region of space scarred by the remnants of an ancient Xeno-empire. The humans inhabiting the system had built their own civilization from the bones of alien ruins, creating societies structured around competition, survival, and constant suspicion. The Imperium demanded unification, obedience, conversion to the imperial truth. Luffy, however, stepped into the negotiations with the same open warmth he showed all liberated peoples. The meeting hall was a cathedral of fractured stone, lit by torches that cast jagged shadows along the walls. Luffy entered with his officers, removed his helm, and smiled at the wary leaders gathered before him. "We're not here to take anything from you," he said. "We're here to build something together." His words stirred unease. These leaders had grown up surrounded by ruins, where trust was a promise only fools made. They eyed his outstretched hand with doubt. His cheerful tone struck them as a threat disguised by kindness. When Luffy attempted to ease their fears, the tension only grew. His nature was too sincere for a world that had forgotten what sincerity looked like. The stalemate deepened over days. Luffy's patience remained unbroken, but his captains recognized the danger. This system needed guidance, structure, the kind the Imperium demanded. If the negotiations failed, war would follow, and the Starbound would be forced to shed blood Luffy desperately wished to avoid. His ideals met a wall built from centuries of distrust, and into that fragile balance stepped Horus. The War Master arrived in orbit aboard the vengeful spirit, his presence spreading through the system like the shadow of a god descending. Where Luffy radiated warmth, Horus radiated strength, noble, commanding, sharply aware of the realities that shaped empires. When the brothers embraced upon the landing platform, the Starbound watched with reverence. Horus laughed warmly, lifting Luffy off the ground in a brief, crushing hug before setting him back down. "It's good to see you, little brother," Horus said. "The galaxy speaks highly of you." Luffy beamed. "Really? That's good." Horus studied him with a smile laced with something deeper, affection, admiration, and quiet concern. "But they also speak cautiously. You give too much trust, too much freedom." "People should be free," Luffy said simply. "If they choose to join us, it should be because they want to, not because they're scared." Horus sighed, placing a hand on Luffy's shoulder. "The Imperium is not a band of wanderers seeking adventure. It is an empire, and empires require order, unity, certainty. You cannot build unity on good intentions alone." Luffy's expression hardened, not in anger, but in unshakable conviction. Unity built on fear breaks the moment fear fades. Horus paused, surprised by the sharpness of those words. The simplicity of Luffy's world view held a truth that even the War Master could not dismiss outright. But Horus also saw the consequences dancing like embers on the edge of catastrophe. He had witnessed worlds tear themselves apart because trust was offered too freely. He understood that idealism without structure could fracture the very unity the Emperor sought to forge. They returned to the negotiations together. The leaders of the system watched with widened eyes as two Primarchs entered their hall. One a towering storm of command, the other a gentle blaze of hope. Their contrast unsettled the room in ways neither realized. Horus addressed the leaders with an iron voice. "The Imperium offers protection, knowledge, and a place within a future greater than any isolated world can imagine. Refuse, and you will be left alone in a galaxy that devours the weak." A silence fell. Luffy stepped forward beside him. "We'll help you stand. You don't have to kneel. The leaders recoiled, torn between fear and bewilderment. Horus shot Luffy a warning glance, subtle but unmistakable. Luffy didn't flinch. He couldn't. His truth was his strength. Yet the divided messages only sowed uncertainty. Factions within the system rose in argument. Some inspired by Luffy's promise of freedom, others drawn to Horus's promise of strength. Riots broke out. Cities ignited. The negotiations collapsed in a storm of old grudges and new anxieties. Luffy moved to intervene the moment blood spilled. He stretched across burning streets, saving civilians from collapsing towers. He absorbed grenade blasts to shield children hiding beneath debris. His presence inspired unity among the frightened, gathering them with calm words and unwavering resolve. The Starbound moved with purpose, extinguishing fires, disarming combatants, refusing to kill even when attacked. But Horus saw the danger growing faster than Luffy could contain it. What Luffy viewed as a chance to heal, Horus recognized as the spark of a rebellion that would spread across the subsector. He commanded orbital forces to fire warning shots, precise, calculated detonations that shattered mountain peaks and sent tremors across entire continents. Luffy's head snapped upward as the shockwaves rolled beneath his feet. His eyes widened with horror. "Horus, stop." "This is the only language they understand," Horus replied over Vox, voice steady. "They must know the consequences of defiance." "They're scared," Luffy answered. "This will just make them more scared. That fear will keep them alive. That fear will break them." The two brothers stood at opposite ends of belief, the gulf widening like a fracture in the hull of a ship under strain. In the end, Horus succeeded. The system submitted, trembling beneath the shadow of the vengeful spirit. Unity was achieved, but it was unity forged in terror, not trust. Luffy walked through the aftermath with a quiet heaviness in his chest. He freed the injured, comforted the grieving, but the people would not meet his gaze. They bowed, not in gratitude, but in fear. And that fear wrapped around Luffy like cold chains, far heavier than anything he had worn on Carthion 9. That night, as the Starbound boarded their ships, Horus met him in silence. The War Master placed a hand on Luffy's shoulder. "You have a good heart," he said softly, "but hearts alone cannot rule the stars." Luffy said nothing. Horus withdrew his hand, a shadow passing across his face. In his eyes flickered a strange mixture of sorrow and calculation. And somewhere in that moment, a seed was planted, one that would grow into a choice neither brother could escape. The crusade marched on, but unity, now fractured along invisible lines, would not hold forever. The system that Horus had forced into compliance faded behind the Starbound fleet, its broken cities dimming into pinpricks against the vast sea of stars. Yet the silence that settled over Luffy's flagship was heavier than any battle he had fought. His legion carried the weight of their Primarch's mood, moving with disciplined purpose but subdued spirits. They had seen him stride through fire with fearless joy, had watched him uproot tyrants with laughter still bright in his eyes. But this quiet, inward-looking stillness was something new, something that pressed into the hearts of even the strongest Astartes. He walked the observation deck alone, staring out at the swirling nebula beyond the viewport. The colors reminded him of the warp, those strange, shifting hues he had drifted through in infancy. But where the warp buzzed with malevolent hunger, the nebula felt like a deep, mournful sigh. His reflection stared back at him faintly, eyes shadowed with a confusion that no battlefield could ever inflict. He was built for movement, for joy, for breaking chains. Yet now, A different kind of chain tugged at him, one forged not of iron, but doubt. He remembered Horus's voice, heavy with certainty. Unity requires fear. Luffy closed his eyes, the words scraping against his instincts like a blunt blade. He didn't believe it. He couldn't. Yet he had no answer for Horus's arguments, no weapon that could counter the cold logic of a war master who knew the galaxy's cruelty better than most. Footsteps echoed behind him. Commander Asterion, one of his first and most loyal sons, approached with measured steps. His armor was scarred from countless battles, but his posture carried a gentleness rarely found among space marines. He stopped beside Luffy, helmet held respectfully under one arm. "My lord," Asterion said quietly, "the Council of Primarchs has issued new orders. We are to rendezvous with the Lunar Wolves and the Word-Bearers in the Calthan Reach. A joint operation." Luffy's shoulders tensed. Lorgar again. Asterion nodded. He insists the region hides cult activity. The Emperor's edict forbade him worship, yet he still seeks meaning in shadows. It may be dangerous. Luffy pressed his palms to the viewport. Everything feels dangerous now. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting fear. Not fear for himself, fear for the Imperium, for humanity, for the brothers he loved even when their paths grew difficult. Asterion studied him, sensing the fracture beneath his calm tone. "Your strength is not diminished because others doubt you," Asterion said. "We follow you because you refuse to let the galaxy break you." Luffy gave a small, grateful smile. "But I don't want anyone to break. Not them, not us." Before Asterion could answer, alarms chimed softly, the signal for an incoming encrypted transmission, not from Horus, not from Lorgar. The Imperium's sigils flashed and rearranged themselves, forming a code few could decipher. The Emperor. The screen activated, but no image appeared, only a shifting field of gold. The Emperor's voice resonated through the chamber, low and commanding, yet colored by something almost human beneath the layers. "My son." Luffy straightened instinctively, but his heart did not leap as it once had. The golden radiance flickered, as though even the Emperor's focus strained against some unseen barrier. "You feel it, do you not?" the Emperor continued. "The warp trembles. The minds of your brothers bend beneath pressures they do not yet recognize. The stars themselves whisper of an approaching storm." Luffy waited, uncertain. "There is a rot spreading," the Emperor said. "A distortion in the emotions of those closest to me. It grows more profound with each passing month. Something presses against the fabric of fate, altering paths once clear." Luffy's brow furrowed. "Is it the warp?" "In part, but more dangerous is the subtlety of its work. It does not attack flesh. It corrodes judgment. It amplifies ambition. It cloaks treachery beneath righteousness. You, Luffy, you alone stand untouched by its influence." A chill ran through him. Not fear, recognition. The feeling he had sensed in the meetings with his brothers, the shift in their eyes, the tightening in their tones. It hadn't been mere tension. Something else lingered beneath their words, something dark and hungry. "Why me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because your spirit is not of this universe," the Emperor answered. "The warp does not understand you. It cannot shape you, and so it cannot corrupt you." Luffy pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the steady warmth beneath his ribs. "What do you want me to do?" "Watch your brothers," the Emperor said. "Observe the fractures. Do not confront them yet. The time will come when choices must be made, but not now. For now, I require only your clarity." The transmission dimmed, but before it vanished completely, the Emperor added one final sentence, so quiet it nearly drowned within the static. And guard your hope, Luffy. It may be the last unbroken thing left in this age. The light faded. Astrian inhaled sharply. My lord, what did he mean? Luffy shook his head. I don't know, but something's wrong. Wrong with the warp. Wrong with my brothers. Wrong with everything. Their ships entered the Calthan Reach within hours. The region was dark, too dark. Warp storms flickered at the edges of the system, whispering as though eager to swallow the fleet whole. Luffy stood at the command dais, staring into the shifting tides on the view screens. Astrian approached again. The word-bearers have already landed, he reported. They speak of visions, omens. Lorgar claims he has seen a shadow walking among the Primarchs. Luffy frowned. A shadow? Yes, Astrian replied. A figure with many faces. Luffy felt something twist in his gut, like a hand tightening around a thread only he could feel. The warp outside the viewport pulsed faintly, as though reacting to the thought. Astrian hesitated. Should we proceed, my lord? Luffy lifted his chin. The swirling void ahead of them felt heavy with secrets, with plots spinning in directions he could not yet see. But he had never run from storms, not on Carthion 9, not in the warp, not in battle. He would not start now. He stepped forward, determination kindling in his eyes. We go. The fleet pushed deeper into the Reach, and somewhere within the warp, a whisper laughed softly, not with joy, but with hunger. The Calthan Reach unfolded before them like a wound in the fabric of space, a region where ancient battles had once burned so fiercely that their echoes still trembled through the void. Luffy stood at the command dais of the Sunbreaker as the fleet maneuvered through the debris fields. Twisted wreckage drifted in slow spirals, hulks of ships torn apart centuries ago, their hulls scarred with forgotten sigils. The starbound moved in tight formation, alert and ready, though none of them could name the dread that clung to the void like a scent of blood. Reports poured in from reconnaissance teams. Lorgar's word-bearers were already present, their ships orbiting a barren moon, where ruins of a lost civilization jutted from the dust like broken teeth. Vox chatter from surface teams crackled with static, filled with half-whispered mentions of rituals, chanting, and visions. The starbound officers exchanged dark glances. The Emperor had forbidden all worship, yet the word-bearers found ways to shape disobedience into devotion. Luffy felt it before he heard it, a subtle tightening in his skull, the same tension he had sensed in his brother's presence lately. It was a pressure that seemed woven into the void itself, faint but insidious. When the Sunbreaker descended into low orbit, that pressure sharpened, as though the warp were straining to reach through the material realm. He descended to the moon's surface with a contingent of starbound elites. The air tasted metallic, thick with the dust of long perished worlds. The ruins hummed faintly beneath their feet, as though charged by a buried source of power. Luffy inhaled deeply, searching for clarity amid the haze. The warp's presence lingered like a cold breath on the back of his neck, yet it did not pierce him. It never had. As they advanced, they found Lorgar's forces surrounded by circles of carved symbols. The word-bearers stood in eerie formation, armor washed in flickering torchlight. Their faces were hidden behind helmets etched with script that should not exist. At the center of the ruin, Lorgar himself knelt, head bowed, as if awaiting prophecy. He lifted his gaze when Luffy approached. "Brother," Lorgar said, his voice soft, reverent, filled with a calm that felt wrong. "The shadows have spoken to me. They reveal the truth behind the Emperor's silence." Luffy stopped before him. The truth shouldn't come from shadows. Lorgar smiled sadly. Some truths can only be seen in darkness. The starbound shifted uneasily. Astrian stepped closer, hand on the hilt of his sword. Lorgar rose slowly, his armor shimmering with a faint, pulsing aura. His eyes were no longer gentle. They glowed with an unsettling inner fire. "You feel it, do you not?" Lorgar murmured. "The change in our brothers, the distortion in their hearts. The Emperor hides the cause, but the warp reveals what he will not." "I don't need the warp," Luffy replied, voice steady. "I know when something is wrong in someone's heart." "And yet you do not see what is wrong in your own," Lorgar said gently. "You cling to an ideal that cannot survive the age we live in. Hope is a child's dream. The galaxy demands obedience and sacrifice. We demand truth." Luffy's hand tightened at his side. "The warp isn't truth, is it not?" Lorgar stepped forward. "It is emotion given form, dreams made into echoes, faith shaped into power. And you, brother, you walk untouched through its realm. You alone are pure in a way none of us can comprehend." Astrian growled. "He will not listen to your heresies." Lorgar did not spare the commander a glance. His eyes remained fixed on Luffy. "The warp remembers you," Lorgar whispered. "It hates you, fears you, calls you the one who laughs in its face." Luffy's breath froze. The ruins suddenly trembled, not from tectonics, but from the warp's agitation. Lorgar spread his arms, welcoming the surge. "It reveals more," he said. "A betrayal, a great sundering. One brother will lead it, another will fall to stop it. The Emperor sees the future but will not speak of it. The warp, however, speaks freely." Luffy shook his head. "The warp lies. Not always." Lorgar's voice dipped into something darker. "It shows me Horus at the center, a crown of fire, wings of shadow, blood across the stars." Luffy's heart clenched. He remembered Horus's words, his worry, the shadow behind his gaze. He remembered the Emperor's warning, a distortion of emotions, bending judgment. Before he could speak, an explosion split the air. The starbound scattered as word-bearers surged forward. The ruins erupted with gunfire. Lorgar stepped back into the shadows, eyes burning with prophetic sorrow. "This is the beginning," he said. "You cannot stop it." Luffy's world narrowed to instinct. He stretched forward, grabbing two charging word-bearers and hurling them aside. Astrian fired controlled bursts, striking runes that pulsed with unholy light. The ground cracked, releasing spectral tendrils that grasped toward Luffy's legs, yet slid harmlessly off his skin. The warp recoiled from him. He leapt into the fray, fists striking with shockwave force. Word-bearers flew like rag dolls, crashing into pillars that crumbled under the impact. But for every one he downed, more emerged, chanting in a tongue that scraped against reality itself. Astrian shouted, "My lord, they are trying to isolate us." Luffy felt it too, the battlefield tightening, forces converging, an unseen intelligence directing the chaos. The warp's pressure increased, swirling around him like a storm desperate to close its jaws. But something else stirred beneath that pressure, a new presence, vast and cold as the void. Asterion stumbled, clutching his head. Something is pushing into our minds." Luffy grabbed him before he fell. "Stay with me." A blinding pulse erupted from the ruins, shattering stone and hurling dust into the sky. When the light cleared, the word-bearers were retreating into a shimmering rift. Lorgar stood at its edge, watching Luffy with a mixture of pity and awe. "Horus needs you," he said softly, "but the galaxy will tear your hearts apart." The rift swallowed him. Silence fell. Astrian steadied himself, panting. "My lord, are you hurt?" Luffy stared at the empty space where Lorgar vanished. Something cold gnawed at his chest, something that felt like the first crack in a mirror. "No," he whispered, "but something is coming." He turned toward the stars, "and it's going to break us." The journey back from the Calthan Reach was carved in an oppressive silence, the kind that pressed like invisible hands against the throat. Luffy sat at the heart of the Sunbreaker's strategium, staring at the hololithic projections of systems burning one by one in riots, uprisings, and unexplained eruptions of madness. It felt as though something poisonous had been loosed into the Imperium, spreading through the warp and blooming inside the hearts of men. He felt its echo, faint but present, a coldness that scraped along the edges of reality. His brothers were changing, the galaxy was changing, and even before the first shot of heresy was fired, Luffy sensed the coming fracture like the pressure drop before a storm. When news of Istvan III reached him, the silence broke. The encrypted message was brief, a betrayal cloaked in loyalty, a purge disguised as necessity. Horus and several Primarchs had bombarded their own warriors, those loyal to the Emperor, without warning. The images that followed were hollow, colorless recordings of orbital fire turning cities to ash. Luffy watched them without blinking. Fists, clenched so tightly the metal around him groaned. He felt nothing at first, no rage, no disbelief, only a vast, echoing emptiness, a feeling like falling. Astrion approached, his armor still marred from the skirmish with the word-bearers. "My lord," he said softly, "the War Master has turned." Luffy shook his head once, a small, stubborn motion. "He wouldn't. Horus wouldn't do this. Evidence says otherwise." Evidence. Luffy hated the word. Evidence could be forged. Evidence could lie. But the Emperor's warning whispered like a knife inside his memory, a distortion in the emotions of those closest to me. Lorgar's voice returned as well, a crown of fire, wings of shadow. Even the warp seemed to hum with a glee that made Luffy's skin crawl. "No," he whispered, "not Horus. He's hurting. He's confused. Something's twisting him. I have to reach him." Before Astrion could respond, alarms blared across the strategium. The Sunbreaker's sensors detected multiple fleets dropping from the warp. Massive signatures, coordinated, disciplined. For a heartbeat, the Starbound dared hope it was a loyalist force. But then the transponders flared crimson. Traitor legions, the Iron Warriors, the Sons of Horus, elements of the Emperor's children. Even detachments of the word-bearers materialized like wolves closing in on a wounded prey. Their ships spread across the void in a crescent formation designed with grim precision, cutting the Starbound off from escape, reinforcements, or communication. Astrion cursed under his breath. They came prepared. Luffy stared at the fleet blocking the stars. "They're not here for a fight," he said quietly. "They're here to destroy us before we can choose a side." The first barrage came without warning. Auto-lances fired molten lines across the void, battering the starbound vessels. Explosions rippled through the Sunbreaker's shields, sending tremors through the decks. Luffy grabbed the console to steady himself. All ships, defensive formation. Protect the civilians and the outer decks. His orders carried across the fleet with immediate precision. The Starbound were forged in unity, not blind obedience, and their coordination was seamless, even under sudden attack. But the enemy was overwhelming. Entire Iron Warrior battle groups unleashed their siege cannons with merciless accuracy, tearing through escorts and supply ships. The Sons of Horus closed the distance with hunting formations, firing boarding torpedoes packed with elite warriors. Astrion drew his blade. My lord, we must prepare for boarding. Luffy nodded, though something inside him trembled, not with fear, but with grief. He stretched his arms once, loosening muscles already coiling with instinct. No killing unless there's no other choice. They're our brothers. Astrian hesitated. They do not see us as theirs anymore. That doesn't matter, Luffy murmured, stepping toward the embarkation decks. I see them. The first boarding torpedoes slammed into the hull like thunderclaps. Bulkheads buckled. Alarms wailed. Star-bound warriors raced through the corridors, forming defensive lines where the metal groaned and split. When the hull finally ruptured, traitor Astartes poured through, iron warriors in serrated armor, sons of Horus with eyes blazing like dying suns. The clash was immediate and brutal. Starbound blades met chain axes. Shields clanged against bolter fire. Luffy arrived in the thick of the battle, leaping straight into the heart of the breach. His fist met the leading iron warrior with enough force to blast him back through the breach into open space. Another traitor swung a chain blade. Luffy ducked, body stretching and coiling like fluid motion, before slamming the traitor into the ceiling. But the traitors were relentless. They came in waves, guided by bitter clarity. These warriors had fought beside the Starbound for decades. They knew their strengths, their nature, their refusal to kill if it could be avoided. And they exploited it. Starbound warriors fought with courage that bordered on righteousness, but they were unprepared for the savagery of betrayal. The traitors fought to maim, to cripple, to overwhelm. The corridors filled with sparks and blood, screams and steel. Luffy pushed deeper into the melee, pulling wounded Starbound to safety, knocking traitors unconscious rather than ending them. But the enemy did not care for mercy. They cut down any Starbound who hesitated. Luffy's rage began to coil, tight and hot. His elasticity trembled. He stretched across the hall, intercepting a strike meant for a fallen warrior. "Why are you doing this?" Luffy shouted, voice echoing off metal walls. A son of Horus snarled through his helm. "Because the War Master commands it." "Horus wouldn't order this. You no longer know the War Master." The word struck harder than any blade. The battle raged for hours that felt like years. One by one, Starbound ships fell silent, torn apart or forced into retreating escape vectors. The Sunbreaker shook under constant bombardment. Fires spread through entire decks. Astrian fought with impossible resolve, carving a path back to Luffy's side. "My lord," he shouted over the roar of collapsing bulkheads, "we cannot hold. We must evacuate." Luffy looked at the burning corridors, the injured Starbound dragged away by Medicae, the traitor corpses and unconscious bodies littering the ground. His chest ached. "I won't abandon them. If we fall here, all of the Starbound fall," Astrian said, eyes fierce. "You must survive. You must lead what remains." Another explosion rocked the ship, this one deeper, more final. The reactor was failing. Astrian grabbed Luffy's shoulder, shaking him. "If you die, everything we stand for dies with you." Luffy stared at the chaos, the betrayal, the loss. He felt something inside him shift. Pain unlike anything he had known, raw and deep. Not physical, something larger, something breaking. "Fine," he whispered. They fell back toward the escape decks, the last of the Starbound forming a living shield. Traitor Astartes surged after them. Luffy turned, stretching both arms across the corridor, slamming them into the walls with such force that the metal deformed, sealing the traitors out. Astrian dragged him into the escape craft, as the Sunbreaker groaned under its failing core. The hatch closed. As the Starbound survivors launched into the void, the flagship behind them burst into a silent blossom of fire. golden light devoured by blackness. Luffy did not cry. He simply stared at the fading glow, a hollow ache spreading through him like frost. "My legion," he whispered. Astrian bowed his head. "We will rebuild." But Luffy felt the truth sink into him with the weight of an ocean. Nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. And his brother, his beloved brother, was at the heart of it. The escape craft drifted through the void with only emergency thrusters to guide it, its hull scarred and trembling from the blast that had consumed the Sunbreaker. Inside, the survivors sat in stunned silence, their armor dimmed, their spirits hollowed. The loss of their flagship carved an absence through the ship's interior like a wound no medici could repair. Luffy stood apart from them, hands braced against the cold viewport, staring into the star-strewn darkness as if trying to see something beyond it, something that would explain the betrayal, the devastation, the fracture tearing the Imperium apart. Nothing answered. The void was silent. He felt Asterion approach before he heard him. His commander's steps were heavy, each one carrying the weight of brothers lost and futures stolen. "My lord," he said softly, "the other escape craft have signaled their survival. We have perhaps 3 dozen ships left, a handful of Thunderhawks, fewer transports." He paused, his voice tightening. "Less than 1/10 of the Legion." Luffy closed his eyes. The ache inside him sharpened. "I should have saved them." "There was no saving them," Asterion replied. "We were ambushed by 6 legions. No one could have predicted this." Luffy turned, his gaze fierce with emotion. "I should have saved them." Asterion did not flinch. "You saved who could be saved, and the rest died standing beside you." His tone softened. "That is not failure." Luffy wanted to believe it, but the echo of the starbound dying, their shouts, their determination, their final breaths, etched itself into his mind like a scar. He felt their loss as if each had been a thread connected to him directly, snapped one by one until only a frayed cord remained. But grief did not stop the universe from closing in. The escape craft's proximity alarms crackled, warning of warp storms blooming at the fringes of the system, like malignant flowers. The traitor legions had no reason to pursue. They believed the starbound dead, but the warp itself felt awake, watching. Hunger slid across the hull like the brush of a cold wind. "We can't remain here," Asterion said. "We need to jump." "To where?" Luffy murmured. "To Terra," Asterion answered. "To the Emperor. To the one who must know what Horus has done." Luffy hesitated, not because he doubted the need, but because he feared what he would find at journey's end. The Emperor had warned him. The warp had whispered its threat. And Horus. Part of him still clung to the brother who had embraced him on that landing platform, who had laughed with warmth and pride, who had offered guidance when Luffy stumbled. But that brother felt far away now, behind a curtain of shadow and lies. Asterion pressed his helm to his chest in a formal vow. "If the Imperium is to survive, you must reach Terra. You are uncorrupted, unbroken. The warp cannot twist you. That alone makes you vital." Luffy looked down at his hands, hands that had freed slaves, defeated armies, and protected those who could not protect themselves. Hands that now trembled with grief, but still held strength. Strength given by the Emperor. Strength no warp-born nightmare could corrupt. He nodded. Set course for Terra. The escape craft synchronized with the surviving vessels. Engines ignited with faint, inconsistent burns. The navigators, those not lost during the assault, locked onto Terra's beacon, a psychic signal so bright it pierced even the warp's churning storms. The fleet jumped. Instantly, the world twisted. The warp surged like a living storm around them, claws of raw emotion scraping against the Geller fields. Shapes formed in the roiling currents, faces twisted in malice, legions of shadows marching across impossible horizons, wings of fire and teeth of void-born hatred. Whispers coiled through the corridors, voices mimicking the starbound dead, calling their brothers' names with cruel familiarity. Luffy alone walked the ship without fear. The warp bent around him like wind around a stone pillar, its claws slipping harmlessly from his skin. Where he passed, the light steadied. The whispers faded. The air cleared. His presence was a lighthouse in the storm, quiet, warm, defiant. Astrian followed him through the decks, watching as terrified crewmen straightened in his wake. "It is as the Emperor said," he murmured. "You repel the warp by existing." "Then I'll keep existing," Luffy answered simply. Days blurred into weeks. The warp stormed relentlessly, forming barriers and ripples that forced the navigators to change course 5 times. Twice, they nearly tore out of the Imperium entirely. Once, a bannerling demon clawed its way through a crack in the Geller field, only to dissolve screaming when Luffy touched it. The demon's final cry echoed through the warp like a wounded beast, and for the first time, Luffy felt the warp recoil, not with rage, with fear. The journey sharpened further when distress flares appeared on the fleet's path, ghost signals from scattered loyalists fleeing the early waves of the heresy. The starbound pulled them in, rescuing survivors when possible. Most ships were empty, drifting tombs. Others carried wounded Astartes who had believed the starbound dead. One captain, an Iron Hands veteran, stared in disbelief when he saw Luffy step aboard. "We were told your legion was annihilated," the Iron Hand rasped. We mourned you." Luffy lowered his head. "We mourned a lot of brothers too." The veteran clasped Luffy's arm with reverence. "The war isn't lost. Not while even one Primarch still stands with hope." Luffy did not know how to answer that, but hearing the word hope spoken as if it were a weapon stirred something in him that had dimmed since the fall of the Sunbreaker. He carried that feeling with him as the fleet finally burst free of the warp, emerging battered and fractured into the Sol system. The darkness lifted. Before them, terror shone. Even from light years out, the throne world radiated golden brilliance, a beacon blazing against the void. Giant defense platforms ringed it, cannons powerful enough to shatter continents. Fleets patrolled its perimeter, bristling with weapons aimed outward at any sign of traitorous approach. A sense of gravity, of destiny, settled upon the survivors. Astrian exhaled in awe. "We made it." But the moment their transponders activated, a dozen loyalist warships surged toward them, weapons primed. "Identify yourselves," barked a Vox officer. "This sector is on full alert. Name your legion and state your loyalties." Astrian looked to Luffy, who stepped forward. "This is Luffy," he said, voice steady as bedrock. "Primarch of the Starbound, loyal to the Emperor." Silence crackled across the Vox. Then slowly, weapons lowered. Warships shifted position, forming an escort. The path to terror opened. But as Luffy watched the golden world grow larger, a cold certainty gripped him. The heresy was only beginning. The galaxy was burning. Horus was marching toward the throne. And Luffy. Luffy had arrived too late to stop the first blow, but not too late to face the last. The throne world received Luffy not with celebration, but with thunderous silence. Terra's skies were choked with warships, its continents armored beneath layers of steel bastions and void shields. Every mountain ridge bristled with artillery. Every horizon shimmered with Imperial banners trembling in the wind. As the starbound survivors descended toward the Imperial palace, their battered ships casting long shadows across the ancient spires, Luffy felt the weight of humanity's fear pressing against him like a physical force. There was no cheering crowd, no welcome procession, only the stern gaze of custodians lining the landing avenue, silent, immovable, each a golden sentinel carved from the Emperor's will. When Luffy stepped from the ramp, their halberds dipped in acknowledgement, but not warmth. They had heard the whispers. They knew a storm was coming, and they sensed, without words, that this son had arrived on the edge of destiny. Astrian walked at his side, helmet under one arm, gaze wary. "It feels like a tomb," he murmured. Luffy nodded. The air tasted of ozone, incense, and the faint metallic tang of a world preparing for annihilation. Even the wind felt strained, as though the atmosphere itself braced for impact. The custodians escorted them through the grand halls of the Imperial Palace, vast avenues lined with statues of warriors long dead, murals of victories carved before terror had known the Emperor's light. Every footstep echoed with a hollow finality. When they reached the inner sanctum, the custodians halted. "Only the Primarch may approach," one said, voice deep beneath his helm. Asterion stepped forward instinctively. "He does not go alone." The custodian's halberd barred his path. None but a son may stand on those steps. Luffy placed a hand on Asterion's shoulder. "I'll be fine." He tried to smile to reassure, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Asterion bowed his head in resignation, stepping back into the ranks of the starbound. Luffy turned toward the vast doors ahead, towering constructs of adamant and marble, engraved with scenes of humanity's ascendance. They opened slowly, revealing a long, ascending walkway bathed in golden radiance. The light came from the top of the stairs. From him. Luffy began to climb. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the palace itself tested the resolve of those who dared approach its throne. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, a steady, unyielding rhythm that kept time with the hum of ancient machinery deep within the walls. When he reached the uppermost landing, the world seemed to dim around the single figure seated at the heart of everything. The Emperor. He sat upon the proto-throne. Not yet the life-devouring golden throne of future millennia, but a machine still in its infancy, shimmering with restrained power. His armor gleamed with the radiance of a dying sun. His eyes burned brighter than stars. And yet, even in that overwhelming majesty, something seemed strained, as though threads of the warp tugged at the edges of his form, attempting to unravel him. Luffy stepped forward, heart swelling with conflicting emotion, longing, grief, determination. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "Father." The Emperor lifted his gaze. A ripple passed through the chamber, like the air itself bowed. When he spoke, the words resonated with aeons of authority, yet softened in a way no mortal ear had ever heard. "My son, you have come." Luffy approached slowly. I tried to save them. The Legion. His voice broke. The memory of the Sunbreaker's explosion flashed behind his eyes. "I know," the Emperor said. "Their sacrifice echoes through the warp. Their deaths are not meaningless." Luffy's fist clenched. Horus wouldn't do this. Something's twisting him." The Emperor's expression hardened, a fracture of sorrow deepening around his eyes. Horus was touched, manipulated. The warp seeped into cracks he did not know he carried. I sensed it too late. "Then we can save him," Luffy said, stepping forward with sudden hope. "We just have to reach him, talk to him. I know he's hurting, but..." No, the Emperor's voice cut like a blade. Luffy froze. Horus has made his choice, the Emperor continued, tone heavy with finality. He marches on terror with the full force of betrayal. He seeks my throne, my life, the domination of mankind. The woman who raised him could not sway him. His brothers could not sway him. And soon, neither will you. Luffy shook his head. You're wrong. He's still my brother. He still cares. He fears you. The words hit harder than any blow Luffy had ever taken. The Emperor rose, the vast chamber trembling with the shift of his power. He fears that you stand where he once did, untouched by the warp, unbroken by ambition, untainted by pride. He fears you because the galaxy whispers your name as a symbol of what he once wished to be. Luffy stared, stunned. I never wanted that. But he believes you will take everything from him, his destiny, his legacy, his father's love. A silence settled, deep, suffocating. Luffy finally whispered, I don't want to fight him. You must, the Emperor said, or terror will fall, humanity will fall. All we have built will be consumed. Luffy's heart tightened, breath catching. The idea of raising his fists against Horus felt like betrayal carved into his bones. But the Emperor's presence pressed against him with relentless truth. He took another step toward the throne. Then fight him with me, together. No. A strange, pained expression crossed the Emperor's face. I cannot leave Terra. The Webway project teeters on collapse. Should I abandon it, demons will flood this world. I am bound here, until the end. Luffy's eyes widened. Then who will stand with you? You will. The air seemed to freeze. I cannot command you, the Emperor said quietly. But I ask you, as your father, as the one who shaped your destiny, stand with me, face the storm, carry hope into a battle where none remains. Luffy trembled, not from fear, but from the agonizing collision between love and duty. The Emperor stepped closer, placing a hand on Luffy's shoulder. The touch was warm, impossibly gentle. There is more, he said. Something I have not told you. Something the warp screams to conceal. Your existence threatens it. You are a tear in its logic, a contradiction, a being it cannot corrupt or predict. Luffy blinked. So what does that mean? It means, the Emperor said, that you are the key to this war, one way or another. Before Luffy could reply, the chamber shuddered. A psychic tremor rippled through the palace. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. He has begun his march. Luffy felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. Horus. The Emperor stepped back toward the throne, power gathering around him like stormlight. Your path begins now, my son, he said. Whether it leads to salvation or tragedy, only you can decide. Luffy stared at his father, at the golden ruler whose love was fracturing beneath the weight of cosmic war, and a single tear slipped down his cheek, not of sorrow, of resolve. He turned toward the steps. Horus was coming, and the laughter that once defied the warp would soon face the greatest darkness of all. Luffy stepped down from the throne's radiant platform as the Emperor's final words echoed like a fading heartbeat in his mind. The vast hall behind him hummed with power, golden light pulsing like the breath of a sleeping titan. But beyond its doors, terror was no longer asleep. The world trembled. War drums beat across the void. Horus had begun his march, and every second carried the weight of stars collapsing into ruin. The custodians waited in solemn formation. Their silent eyes followed Luffy as he descended the immense stairs, each step slower than the last. Astrian stood at the bottom, helm tucked beneath one arm, posture rigid with expectation. When Luffy reached him, the commander studied his Primarch's expression and understood without asking. "You spoke with him," Astrian said quietly. "And he told you what must be done?" Luffy nodded. "Horus is coming, and I have to stop him." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they carried a gravity that hollowed the air. Astrian's jaw tightened. "We will stand with you." Luffy shook his head. "No, this path is for me." Astrian froze. "My lord, we are all that remains of the Starbound. We will not abandon you now." "You won't," Luffy said softly. "But you can't follow me where I'm going." Astrian's eyes narrowed. "Why?" The Primarch hesitated, searching for words to express a truth he barely understood. "Because this isn't a battle of strength, or armies, or fortresses." His gaze drifted upward, toward the distant heavens where Horus approached with a storm fit to swallow a world. "This is about hearts, about choices, about everything that broke between us." Astrian felt his breath leave him. "He is lost, my lord." "No," Luffy whispered. "He's hurting. He's afraid. And something in the warp is using that fear to twist him. If I meet him with hate, then I'm only helping the thing that corrupted him." Astrian bowed his head, grief trembling through him. "Then what will you do?" Luffy exhaled slowly. "What I've always done. I'll reach for him." The commander closed his eyes. "Then I will wait for your return." Luffy placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and warm. "Thank you." Before Astrian could answer, a distant roar split the air. The palace shook. Sirens wailed across the throne world as enemy signatures entered the Sol system in force. Massive, warp-tainted vessels that blotted out the void. Traitor legions flooded forward behind them, their banners burning with symbols twisted by chaos. The siege of terror had begun. Luffy turned toward the balcony, stepping into the cold wind that swept across the Imperial Highlands. The horizon blazed with fire, orbital debris streaking across the sky, defense platforms detonating under traitor bombardment, Titan engines awakening with thunderous strides. In the distance, the ocean boiled under falling wreckage. Across the plains, regiments of the Imperial army rushed into position, their ranks trembling beneath the weight of dread. Astrian joined him at the railing. "We cannot wait long," he said. "Horus will push the assault straight toward the palace. He wants the Emperor. He wants everything." "He won't get him," Luffy replied. "He'll try to get me first." Astrian glanced sharply at him. "Why you?" Luffy turned to face him fully. "Because the warp sees me as its enemy, and because Horus sees me as his last obstacle. If I go to him, I draw him away from terror, away from the Emperor." Astrian's voice dropped to a whisper. "He'll kill you." Luffy shook his head. "No, he'll try to break me, but he can't." Astrian stared at the Primarch, at the boy who had grown into a legend despite never losing the simple, stubborn heart of a child, and realized that Luffy genuinely believed every word he spoke, not from arrogance, but from a purity that defied the logic of an age drowning in blood. "How will you reach him?" Astrian asked. Luffy looked out to the stars again. "The warp tore open a path when I first came into this universe. It'll open another when he's close enough." Astrian swallowed hard. "Then, this may be farewell." Luffy smiled softly. "Only if I fail." He accepted the commander's salute, folded with reverence and grief, then turned as orange light spilled across the halls, fire from a distant impact blooming against the sky. The palace shook again. Dust fell from the carved ceilings like ancient snow. Luffy felt the warp shiver. He felt Horus's presence growing nearer, a vast, dark shadow cutting through the void, wrapped in fury and the whispers of gods. He walked alone through the palace corridors, past statues of heroes older than memory, past murals depicting victories that now felt like hollow prophecies. He reached the outer ramparts where the wind howled like a wounded beast, carrying the scent of ozone and burning metal. He closed his eyes. The warp stirred. A fissure of blue and violet light shimmered before him, thin at first, then widening, as though recognizing the one who had once passed untouched through its madness. The air vibrated, resonant with a low, hungry growl. The warp welcomed him not with malice, but with anticipation, as if eager to witness what came next. Luffy stepped toward the tear, but before he crossed, he turned one last time. Below, the starbound survivors gathered on the battlements, watching him with eyes full of devotion and sorrow. Astrion stood at their head, offering no command, no protest, only a silent vow of faith. Luffy raised a hand to them. They saluted as one. Then he stepped into the warp. The rift swallowed him in a burst of light, and as terror trembled under the first full assault of the heresy, a lone Primarch was carried across the Imperium toward a confrontation that would shape the fate of the Imperium, toward Horus, toward truth, toward a dawn that might be final indeed. The warp carried Luffy, as though remembering the shape of him, not with hatred, nor with hunger, but with a wary, trembling curiosity. Its tides curled around him like smoke around a flame, recoiling whenever they drew too near. Colors without name swirled around his form, bending and stretching as if influenced by his own strange elasticity. The warp had not forgotten the child who had once drifted through it, laughing. Nor had it forgiven him. Yet now it parted before him, forming a path that led toward a towering presence burning at the center of the storm. Horus. The War Master's aura radiated through the Imperium like a firestorm, cracking reality with each pulse of will. Luffy felt the pressure long before he saw him, a vast emotional gravity twisting the very currents of the warp. Rage, betrayal, pride, pain. The warp fed on all of it, wrapping those emotions in layers of demonic whispers until the man within them seemed buried beneath an avalanche of shadows. Luffy's pace quickened. He stretched, cutting through an eddy of screaming light. The closer he came, the louder the warp grew, its voices hissing warnings, temptations, promises. They slithered into the air around him. He will kill you. He will break you. He will not listen. Luffy shook his head. Doesn't matter. The warp shrieked. A final ripple of distortion opened before him, revealing a titanic platform formed from blackened stone and molten glass, suspended above a chasm of endless nothing. On that impossible plane stood Horus. His armor glowed with burning runes, the eye of Horus blazing on his chest like a second sun. The War Master turned slowly, and the warp itself bowed around him. When his gaze fell upon Luffy, something flickered behind his eyes. Shock, memory, a brief spark of the warmth they once shared. But it vanished beneath the smothering weight of corruption. So, Horus said, voice deep and resonant, distorted by the warp's echo. The Emperor sends his favorite. Luffy stepped forward, feet steady on the twisted stone. He didn't send me. I came. Horus's expression tightened. To beg me to stop? No, Luffy answered softly. To talk to my brother. A low, humorless laugh rolled through the Imperium. The very air cracked under the sound. Your brother is gone. The moment the Emperor chose you, chose your purity, your freedom, over his true sons, he died. Luffy shook his head. He didn't choose. I just exist. Exactly, Horus hissed, stepping closer. The warp flared behind him like wings formed from ruin. You exist without flaw, without weakness, without the scars we all carry. Do you know what it felt like to see you, something untouched, unbroken, standing where we bled? Luffy's chest ached. Horus, I never wanted to take anything from you. But you did, Horus growled. Do you know the whispers that crawled through my mind? That you were the Emperor's perfect son, that you would replace us, replace me. That's not true, Luffy urged. You're my brother. Nothing replaces that. Brotherhood, Horus repeated, voice rising. Where was brotherhood when he chained us to roles we could not choose? When he lied to us? When he hid the truth of the warp? When he forced me to bear the burden of a war I could never win? Luffy stepped forward again. The platform shook. If you're hurting, let me help. Horus froze. For a moment, a heartbeat, somewhere behind the armor of corruption, behind the demonic power coiling around his soul, the man Luffy loved flickered into focus. His eyes softened. His breath quivered. Something inside him leaned toward Luffy, like a drowning man reaching for a rope. Then the warp tightened its grip. Horus staggered as tendrils of shadow wrapped around his limbs, sinking into the cracks of his spirit. He snarled and wrenched against them, but the warp fed on his weakness, his rage, his doubt. You see, he roared, there is no going back. The platform cracked beneath his feet. Chains of dark light erupted from the ground, latching onto him like the anchors of a monstrous will. Luffy's heart clenched as he realized the truth. Horus was not fully in control. The warp was driving him, twisting him, shaping him into a weapon aimed at terror. Horus, Luffy shouted, stretching forward as the War Master braced himself. Fight it! You're stronger than this. I am stronger, Horus roared. Stronger than him, stronger than fate, stronger than... He lunged. The warp howled as Horus struck with the force of a collapsing star. Luffy's body stretched instinctively, absorbing the blow and redirecting the momentum. A shockwave split the air. Horus staggered back, eyes widening with shock that bordered on fury. You still refuse to strike, he hissed, even now. This isn't a fight, Luffy said. It's a rescue. Horus charged again. This time the blow cracked stone, sending shards of molten glass into the void. Luffy bent like wind, dodging, deflecting, refusing to counterstrike. Each time Horus attacked, Luffy absorbed or redirected the force, his body moving with fluid precision that belonged to a different universe, a universe that had known freedom instead of chains. The War Master's rage grew unbearable. Stop! He bellowed, hammering blow after blow. Running! Each strike grew wilder, fueled by desperation. From me! I'm not running, Luffy shouted back. I'm trying to reach you. For a moment they froze, locked in place. Horus's breath was ragged. The warp pulsed violently around him. Why? The War Master whispered. Behind the corruption, he sounded almost lost. Why risk yourself? Why fight for me? Luffy's voice trembled. Because you're my brother. Horus shut his eyes. The platform fell silent. And then, the warp screamed. A towering vortex formed behind Horus, its maw filled with demonic faces shrieking in hunger. Chains of psychic force lashed out, wrapping around his limbs, his chest, his throat. The voices hissed, "You belong to us. Finish him. End the last threat." Luffy watched in horror as Horus was lifted into the air, twisted by the warp's will. The War Master's eyes snapped open, one burning gold, the other bleeding crimson. His voice emerged in two layers, one human, one monstrous. I can't fight it. You don't have to fight it alone, Luffy shouted, leaping forward. The warp vortex reacted with fury, hurling a storm of psychic knives toward him. They shattered harmlessly against his skin. He reached for Horus. But the demonic presence screamed, "If we cannot break him, then we break you." The warp lashed out, gripping Luffy's very essence, attempting to constrict, corrupt, consume. But nothing happened. The warp recoiled as if burned. Luffy pushed forward step by step, defying a cosmic force built on fear and despair. He reached Horus and grabbed his arm, warm, shaking, desperately human under the corruption. Horus gasped, "Luffy, leave, run." "No," Luffy whispered. And then the warp howled. A beam of murderous psychic energy erupted from the vortex, aimed directly at Luffy's chest. Horus's eyes widened with horror. "Move!" But Luffy didn't. He stretched, wrapping his body around Horus like a shield. The beam struck. There was no scream, no explosion. Only light, golden, warm, familiar. It poured from Luffy's chest, from his heart, from a place untouched by the universe's cruelty. The beam fractured, unraveling into harmless radiance. The vortex shrieked in agony as the light spread across the platform, dissolving chains, dispelling shadows, peeling demonic corruption from Horus like ash in the wind. The War Master collapsed to his knees, dazed, freed. Luffy swayed, his vision dimmed. The light faded from his skin. "Luffy, what have you done?" Horus whispered, voice cracking. Luffy smiled weakly. "Protected you, like always. But you..." Horus reached for him, hands trembling. "You burned yourself out." "I'm okay," Luffy murmured. His voice was soft, fading. "You're safe. That's what matters." Horus shook his head violently. No, stay with me." But Luffy's knees buckled. His body, so elastic, so unbreakable, suddenly felt heavy, mortal. He leaned into Horus's arms as though finally allowing himself to rest. The warp, wounded by its failure, began to collapse around them. "Listen," Luffy whispered. "Go back, help them, protect everyone, be the brother I always knew." Horus's eyes filled with tears. I will." Luffy's smile brightened one last time. Then the warp swallowed his fading light. Horus screamed his name. The Imperium trembled, and somewhere, far beyond the reach of time or gods, the echo of a boy's laughter drifted into eternity. An echo that darkness could never silence. An echo the Imperium would remember for 10,000 years, even after the stars themselves began to fade.